Arthur Young is, as I said, the only one of these men who was directly interested in astrology. But alas, we won't be talking about much in this about his interest in astrology. Just the fact that he was interested in it was very important to him. He was born in the same year as Gebser, comes out of the same generation. And with Arthur Young, we begin to return, in a certain sense, to the great chain of being, rather than just the evolution of human consciousness, as with Spengler and Gebser. We have now a return to the classical chain of being, where we take the whole cosmos into account. Although Young is not quite as integral as Steiner in terms of including, cosmic hierarchies of angels and so forth. We sort of leave that out of account. But otherwise, everything else is included: the plant world, the animal world, the inorganic world. He sees this whole thing. Young started off as a kind of scientist. He was an engineer. He invented the Bell helicopter. The Bell helicopter, he sort of was actually looking around for a good problem to solve, to sort of teach himself how to solve problems. And he was interested initially in relativity, and he was studying Einstein and studying mathematics for a while. He was born in France, but then moved over to America. And so he wandered around for a while, but he was also always interested in the occult. He was always interested in manifestations of the occult, and when you read his autobiography, you can see him wandering around, taking up with one sort of practitioner of the occult after another. I mean, he was very fascinated with it. And it took him forever to sit down and write something. His books aren't written until, I believe, he's in his 70s. So he had this incredibly long-lived life. He died, I think, in 93 or 94. And he was a very patient man. And so after he invented the Bell helicopter and got that off the ground, got it patented, and began to have a reliable source of income from that, he was able to just sort of wander around and, sort of do all these things. He wandered out to Berkeley, California, where he founded the Institute for the Study of Consciousness, and just everything under the sun really sort of interested him in that sense. His autobiography was left unpublished at the time of his death, and I have here a chapter from it by one of his pupils is putting it together. And this autobiography is unique in one primary respect. It is the only biography so far in history that includes his astrological transits. He wrote all of his astrological transits in the margins of this manuscript so that you can follow the unfolding of his life course and read the transits. Now, I'll pass this around so you guys can just glance at what he's doing. The only problem is I can't read, there are certain areas of astrology that I don't know, such as progressions, and he was very fascinated. He was, pretty much into the tropical zodiac, and he was very fascinated with progressions, arcs, and the parts of fate. And not everybody is into those, and so I can't read those transits. I don't understand their significance, so I'll have to learn that. But it is fascinating just sort of in and of itself. I'll pass that around. This is the only thing that's available from that manuscript right now is just this chapter that this woman circulated at one of these meetings. The Anodos Foundation is the foundation of the Arthur Youngians. So he was completely taken by astrology. He had a very mathematical mind. He was very much interested in geometry and mathematics. And his two primary books are The Geometry of Meaning, which I haven't read yet. It's a little bit forbiddingly technical for me, in the sense that what he does in that is he compares all the measure formulae in physics with how they work out in relationship to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And that's The Geometry of Meaning, and that's sort of a challenge to sit down and look at that. The other great book that he wrote is The Reflexive Universe, and that's the one we'll be talking about here. And both of them, I think, came out in the mid-70s, 1975, 76. And he was very well along in his life by that time. Very slow, patient thinker. And so he said he was hooked up. He became interested in astrology as a result of studying Jung. He said he studied Jung for a very long time. And there's another book by him that's published that's a series of diaries called The Bell Notes, A Journey from Physics to Metaphysics, where he talks about, it's just selections from his diaries during the period when he's beginning to move out of the development of the Bell helicopter and beginning to think about these spiritual matters. So he himself had this sort of metanoic transition, this sort of shift into the world of kind of engineering and the hard sciences and the American technological approach to culture into a more spiritual approach. And What he did in The Evolution of Consciousness, which is the subtitle of the Reflexive Universe, is he sort of retrieves the myth of the fall. This ancient Gnostic myth that light originally is something that has fallen into matter. One of my favorite myths that's worth recounting in this respect is the Manichaean creation myth that illustrates sort of the background that he's coming out of, and also Steiner, to a large extent, is sort of reviving these ancient Gnostic themes, whereby light has fallen into matter, and it's trying to get out again, to get back to its source. But it's not just a process where you sort of have a fall, sinking, capture, and then return. It's return with a developed consciousness that is capable of recognizing that return. That's why the human being is necessary as a sense organ to participate in this sort of project with nature, so that we can develop these structures and become self-aware, and through us, nature is becoming aware of itself through our own self-awareness. In the Manichaean creation myth, and Mani was, this sort of, he represents, this is clear back in the 3rd, 4th century A.D., Mani represents the culmination of Gnosticism. And the Gnostic movement has very definite parameters. It really begins with the John Gospel, which was written in 100 A.D. The John Gospel is generally regarded as the founding text of Gnosticism, because you get a new theological vocabulary in there that isn't in the other 3 Gospels. And Christ is sort of envisioned as this, Steiner, as this sort of avatar wandering around on the earth. And in that Gospel, it's also the first Gospel in which no mention is made of the coming end of the world. And so this is why I don't think the same John is the author of the Apocalypse of John, and particularly because the John who wrote the John Gospel and wrote the 2 letters of John is a John who saw God as a God of compassion and love and tenderness and mercy and kindness. The John who wrote the book of Revelation is not that same John. He saw God as this gigantic, vengeful, terrifying God, as a sort of sublime God who would come and punish those who deserve to be punished, and those who haven't converted. I mean, it's a frightening vision. But on the other hand, it may have been the same man. Well, who knows? The human psyche is very complex. But the John Gospel comes in about 100 A.D. It's this first sort of Gnostic text, and the church for a very long time refused to accept it as canonical for those reasons. But after the shift out of apocalypticism, the apocalyptic period, remember Spangler says, anytime you get this apocalyptic fascination, you've got the birth of a new culture coming into being. We're moving into that right now. But that period that signified the birth of the Magian consciousness extends from the first apocalyptic texts come in with the Hebrews about 150 BC and extend to, with the John Gospel, up to 100 AD. Although the John Gospel is not apocalyptic, it marks the transition to Gnosticism. And within that apocalyptic epoch there, the book of Daniel and 1 Enoch are the first apocalypses. And the Hebrews are really, during this period, getting very, very anxious about this pseudomorphosis problem, where they're being ruled at that time by the Greeks, and the Greeks come in and try to make them abandon their rituals and sacrifice to Zeus, and they don't want to do that, so they revolt against the Greeks, and this becomes the whole tradition of the Maccabean revolt. But then out of that comes the apocalyptic period. That flares up, dies down, then you get to the John Gospel, and you get the shift into Gnosticism. Now, why should that be? Not only do we have the birth of the Magian civilization there, but in the John Gospel, we have this idea that instead of an apocalypse, there will come a third personage, namely the Paraclete. And the Paraclete will be this being who will come down to finish the revelation of whatever it is that God has to communicate to man. And so Christ doesn't speak of apocalypse, he speaks of this one who will come to comfort you. My advocate will come and will comfort you and will descend down. So it's left very ambiguous about who this Paraclete was. So during the next few centuries, as Gnosticism gets going, you get a number of prophets who step forward and proclaim themselves as the Paraclete that was prophesied in the John Gospel. And there are a whole bunch of them. And Mani was one of the last ones. Mani proclaimed himself in the 3rd or 4th century AD as the Paraclete by the John Gospel. But Mani really was brilliant and really did have something brilliant to say about all of this. And he attempted to create a religion that would be the primary competitor against Christianity as the great world religion. And he thought the best way to do this would be to create a synthesis of Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity. So he sets out to do this. He may actually have journeyed to India. he was living in the Near East, kind of in the sort of Babylonian culture world at that time, and he may have journeyed to India. The Gospel of Thomas, the one that was recovered, the mystical Gnostic Gospel, comes from the same culture zone that he was living in. So he was picking up these mystical influences. And eventually, he was Persian, though. He was primarily part of the Persian Empire. And eventually they had him crucified because they couldn't tolerate. His religion was really gaining strong adherents, and it was becoming a primary competitor against Zoroastrianism. And he really sort of, as we'll see, sort of reworks the Zoroastrian mythology. And in the beginning, he says, there was this kingdom of light. And there was a sort of god of light living within this kingdom. And then there was a kingdom of darkness down below it. And the two were absolutely separate. So that the Manichaean cosmos moves through three very simple epochs, where light and darkness in the beginning are completely separate. In the middle, they're intermixed. And at the end of time, they'll be separate again. So in the beginning, you have light above, darkness below. And the god of light perceives that the god of darkness is jealous of this kingdom of light and is making moves to begin to attack. And so he mentions to his consort Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, that this is going to happen, and she produces forth out of herself an emanation, the Anthropos, the primal man of light, who then puts on an armor of light, a suit of light, and goes down to do battle with these beings, exactly like the Archangel Michael going down to do battle with Satan. So he descends wearing this armor of light down into the realm of darkness to fight these beings, but he loses the fight, and the demons of darkness come and they rip off of his armor, and they eat the armor. So now they've got the light trapped inside of their bodies. And he himself has to be fished out of this kingdom. He's fallen, and his mission has gone badly. Has to be fished out by the Holy Spirit, who descends down, and the actual handshake originated with the Manichaean recognition of this hand that reaches down into the darkness to pull the fallen Anthropos back up to the realm of light. So the Manichaeans developed the handshake as this recognition of that myth, so it comes out of this. And so he comes back up, but meanwhile, down in the kingdom of darkness, what happens is these beings have swallowed these light particles within them. And the Holy Spirit sets about above. They're watching this happen. He sails forth in his moon boat, as it were, and he sort of appears to the male demons as this beautiful woman. And so they masturbate and ejaculate, and their ejaculation and light particles in the Manichaean world is transmitted by way of semen. That becomes important for Augustine, who starts as a Manichaean and says that the reason Christ is separate from everyone else is because he was born of a virgin, and therefore the original sin is not transmitted through semen to Christ. So this becomes important for the later formulation of Christianity, this idea of the semen carrying the light particles. They ejaculate, it goes into the ground, and upspring these little plants. The other female demons, on the other hand, look up and they see this Holy Spirit in the guise of kind of Adonis figure, and they spontaneously give birth to these little monstrosities who go crawling on the ground and immediately start eating up the plants that have sprung up from the ejaculated semen of the other monsters. Now they have the light particles within them. So you begin to get the sense of layers and layers and layers densifying over these light particles. They're becoming trapped. This is basically what we saw yesterday with Steiner. It's a variation of this whole mythology. So now you have these little beings who are wandering around with these particles of light trapped in their bodies. And now the sort of beings of darkness begin to get nervous about this, and they know that the kingdom of light wants these light particles back. So they say, well, how best can we keep these light particles trapped down here? And they think, well, let's create a primal couple who will represent the trapping of these particles of light. So they bring in this couple who then carves up these little monsters and they eat them. Now they have the particles of light within them, they perform sexual intercourse, and out comes Adam and Eve. And so they've gone through this long evolutionary fall in which they've gradually densified and captured particles of light within them. And so the difference of the fall in this tradition is that it isn't the result of man. It isn't the result of man's fall. It's something that's happened in the cosmos already, long before man appears on the scene. So the universe is fallen. And the way in which these particles of light are released is done in the Manichaean world through practices of asceticism. There was this sort of inner circle who were ascetics, who did not eat meat, who were vegetarians, and they could release particles of light by eating fruit fruit contained the highest concentration of these light particles. And eating fruit is liberating the light particles. They're filling up inside of you so that when you die, your soul will go up to the moon, and the moon every month fills up because it's filling up with these liberated light particles that are gradually being restored to heaven. Then those light particles are shot back into the sun, and that's where they go, and that's how they get back to the kingdom of light, through the human participation of this liberation process, eating and eating fruits and vegetables and doing these other things. So it's a very weird, complex Steinerian system in many respects. And sexual intercourse is, of course, the process whereby new beings are trapped within matter. So ideally for the ascetics, you don't want to have sexual intercourse, but the outer group of the Manichaeans are able to marry and have sex and reproduce, but they can't be considered part of the inner elite circle if they're involved in the life process. So that's the Manichaean myth, and that gives you a sense of where Arthur Young is coming from with respect to this vision of the descent of light into matter. It's trapping, and ultimately it's, in that tradition, it has to figure out how to get out of matter through man's participation, and I guess indeed in Arthur Young it's sort of the same process. And so in Arthur Young, if we sort of imagine this V, and here we are back with Steiner's V, but it's a slightly different one, although it has the same basic connotation of gradual sinking, fall into matter, and release, is light is at the top here. Light is absolutely free, and there's a relationship between freedom and constraint. Light has 3 degrees of freedom and no constraint whatsoever, the way he maps this out. Light densifies, and I guess at a certain frequency will generate protons. Don't be afraid to help me out here, Don, if you need to. Light goes down into and produces subatomic particles, which are the next phase of the process. And the protons and so forth have densified, and they have trapped light within these particles. And subatomic particles now have 2 degrees of freedom, 1 degree of constraint. So the fall has to do with this loss of freedom. As we get down to the Newtonian world, there'll be this, he's sort of constructing the great chain of being to get to the Newton world, where everything was absolutely deterministic. But then in the living world, there'll be this return back to freedom. So we have the particles of subatomic particles, and then you have atoms come in, and they trap the subatomic particles within the atoms, and then you have sort of 1 degree of, or rather 3 degrees, what is it, 3, 2, 1, sorry, and then 0, 1, 2. 1 degree of freedom, 2 degrees of constraint. And then finally we get the inverse of what we had before at the molecular level. We have absolute capture, a total loss of freedom. And this is why the laws of classical physics are completely deterministic. Matter at the macro level, at the level of planets and stars and suns and galaxies, the sandwich world that we're living in now, does appear to be absolutely deterministic, determined by the laws of causality, determined by the laws of science, because you have these large aggregations that have built up from these other kingdoms, and they become more and more trapped, the more bonded they become in the world of molecules and molecular combinations. So that's the 4th level. Then we get to the 5th level, where we begin to get now the reverse of this, which is simply the same in mirror image. Now we begin to get back the 1 degree of freedom with plants. Plants have 1 degree of freedom, 2 degrees of constraint. They are re-achieving the same freedom that atoms had. And the reason that is so has to do with a concept that Jung develops called about symmetry. We'll see that just in a second, though. That's 5. And then 6, we have animals, of course. And you know where this is going with 7. The kingdom, instead of calling it the human kingdom, he calls it dominion, and says that really the human is a subset of the dominion kingdom. We'll put human here. So, and then these are the mirror image of those. Animals have 2 degrees of freedom, 1 degree of constraint, and the human being has recaptured the initial freedom of light, 3 degrees of freedom, 0 degrees of constraint. So that it is through the transformation of human consciousness that light regains its initial freedom. And indeed, in all the great religious traditions of the world, we have the spiritual process characterized as an illumination, an infection of the consciousness with light. If you look, for example, at the Hindu model of Jainism, where the soul is this jiva, this monad of light that has become infected with karma, and the idea is to get the karma out of the jiva through stopping doing anything. Anything you do in the Jain system generates karma. Good or bad, karma is bad. You don't want to generate any karma whatsoever. You eat a fruit, you're generating karma. It doesn't blacken the monad with the same dark colors, but it still gives it color. And what you want to do is get it back to that crystalline white purity. And the only way you can do that in the Jain system is by doing nothing. Eventually you have to starve yourself. So as you can imagine, it's not a very popular religion, but it's still around in the world today. That's the odd thing. And the other odd thing is that most of the Jains are bankers.
Bankers?
In India.
How does that work?
I'm not sure. Yeah, they're Hindu bankers.
There's no karma in that?
Oh, sure there is. Yes.
I would think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's funny.
But the idea is that all universally through the world, the spiritual consciousness has to do with this getting the darkness out. Whether it's characterized as karma, whether it's characterized as matter, the darkness has to be gotten out. And the Buddha rejected the Jains as absolutely ridiculous, having this literalistic emphasis on having to starve yourself to death. That's what, when he went out and practiced with yogis, he began to realize, I don't need to starve myself to attain illumination. That's just silly. All you need to do is attain a certain psychological stance that centers you within. It doesn't make any difference what you're doing in terms of these karmic activities. You just have to have that center, that nirvanic center that will disengage you from consciously from the sufferings of the world. So that's Arthur Young's the first aspect of his model. Now, the way in which the freedom and constraint relationship works has to do with symmetry, and neither the human consciousness nor light has any symmetry whatsoever. This is what he says. Particles and animals both have bilateral symmetry, and this is why they have 2 degrees of freedom. There's a certain, the 2 degrees of freedom that subatomic particles have has to do with the uncertainty of position and the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, the uncertainty of position and velocity. There's also a certain ambiguity in terms of where the animal is going to turn up. It has 2 degrees of freedom and uncertainty with respect to position and velocity. It can turn up anywhere. It's got this freedom to move about through space. And this bilateral symmetry is something that animals share in common with subatomic particles. Whereas atoms and plants share in common radial symmetry. And this is why they're more stuck in place. If you look at an atom sort of, from the top down, you see the central nucleus with all in the classical model, with all the whirling electrons. It has a radial symmetry. If you look down at a flower, it's got the same radial symmetry that atoms have. So you have this 1 degree of freedom and 2 degrees of constraint. Both plants and atoms are similarly in a state of bondage, but with a certain amount of freedom. Here at the molecular level, you just have complete symmetry, what's called total symmetry. It's like a frozen lattice that's captured matter to a state where it can't move around at all. This is the sort of mineral world, the periodic table of the elements, the chemicals. Now, when we move into Arthur Young's graph in a second here, because he maps this out in a way also that will look like the periodic table of the elements, but will shed new light on each one of these. He also subdivides these into 4 different levels. So you have 4 levels, 7 stages. And there's a certain asymmetry here because this level is involuntary. Everything happens here in an involuntary way. This half is voluntary. So you have a certain asymmetry between the 2 halves. There's a voluntary, involuntary. Light sort of projects the goal, and human consciousness attains the goal. The particle moves by a charge, and animals also move by a certain kind of energy charge. And then atoms sort of spin off copies of themselves, seed forms, you might say, just as plants give off seeds. Atoms represent the centering principle, giving off centers. And plants also sort of give off centers as these seed copies that are reproductions of themselves. So, in a certain sense, then, what we have are these stages of consciousness in terms of those 7 levels. And the symmetries. Okay. Has everybody got this? model. So both Arthur Young and Rudolf Steiner are coming out of this sort of Gnostic stream. They have a lot of things in common with each other. And then just to familiarize you with the names that he gives a certain power to each of those 7 levels. That you need to abstract the power from the level because they're going to reiterate on each one of those levels. So each one of those levels will reiterate the structure of the whole. Potential, light is the kingdom of potentiality, so that's going to be the potential kingdom. Binding is the 2nd level. You begin to have light is bonded into the proton. And then identity. Atoms begin to form the sense of identity, of a centering structure. And then combination at the molecular level. Growth, the principle of growth at the plant level, the principle of mobility at the animal level, and the principle, once again, just of dominion, what he calls dominion, at the human level. And we'll see how each one of these levels, with the exception of subatomic particles, reiterates this. So here's his Arthur Young's model of the entire great chain of being that he gives. Fit all of it on there. It doesn't quite look like it's going to lose part of it. There we go. These are the 7 kingdoms that I've just written out on the board. You can see the tail end of the molecular. I'll just put it this way. Come on. Light, nuclear particles, atomic, molecular, vegetable, animal, dominion, and potential, binding, identity, combination, growth, mobility, consciousness, and the different degrees of freedom. Light, 3 degrees of freedom, with particles 2 degrees, atoms 1 degree, molecules no freedom whatsoever. Plants retain the 1 degree of freedom that atoms have. Animals retain the 2 degrees of freedom that subatomic particles have, and the human retains the 3 degrees of freedom originally held by the light kingdom. Now, it's blocked up here, but these same potential binding identity combination appear up at the top, going in cross-section, so that each one of these kingdoms reiterates within its own kingdom this overarching structure. Except for the subatomic particles. I don't think he was able to figure out how that would work there, so we left it blank. And he made a kind of half-hearted attempt with respect to the electromagnetic spectrum to slice it up into these 7, but it isn't very convincing, and I don't think he thought it was very convincing. But then once you get down to the level of atoms, the periodic table of elements divides up into 7 distinct levels. That's the way it's organized to begin with. So it is hydrogen at the beginning. Hydrogen is to the periodic table of elements as light is to this entire kingdom. It represents the potentiality within that entire kingdom for that kingdom. And everything is built up then out of that. As you go down the periodic table of elements, hydrogen has the 1 proton and 1 electron. And then you just build it up as you go along through there. And then he's got these broken down in that way. And then he's sort of again, there's a certain artificiality as he tries to assign each one of these to each one of these, and it doesn't work as well in the first 3 kingdoms, but it does work better in the latter 4. So if we come back and we say, here's the molecular kingdom, which he wrote to a chemist and asked the chemist if there was a way in which the chemist knew that the chemical world broke down neatly into 7 domains, and the chemist wrote back and said, yes, as a matter of fact, it does. So we got that from a chemist. You have monatomic metals at the beginning, and I take it these are electrons being conducted through this. And monatomic metals are, to this kingdom, what the hydrogen atom is to that kingdom, what light is to the whole thing. Then what subatomic particles are to the whole thing is what double atoms are, which are salts. You have metals first, then you have salts. And then you have non-functional compounds, the methane series, which corresponds to the third. And then you have functional compounds, corresponding to the principle of combination. And then you have polymers, which are chains now that are being formed, which corresponds to the plant-like principle of growth. Now you're beginning to get this, these formation and storage of this in these sort of carbon chains that he's got linked here. And then you have the creation of proteins, which are chains with side chains that begin to pick up a new kind of mobility that resembles the mobility that animals have within the great chain of being. Until finally you get within that kingdom the creation of DNA and viruses. Viruses are still regarded as non-living. I don't think they are. I think they are alive. But they're regarded as non-living because they can't reproduce without a host. They have to have a cell to go in, invade, and destroy, and in order to force the cell to make copies of themselves. So Arthur Young, consistent with that, puts viruses in the dominion kingdom. This is the absolute dominion. The intelligence of DNA and viruses is such that it represents the dominion kingdom of the combination level, of the level of molecular determinism, what Steiner would call the mineral domain in his world. And then we move to what Steiner would call the plant world, which has the possession of an etheric body, as he says. And then he says we have single-celled bacteria are to this kingdom what light is to the whole thing, what hydrogen is to that periodic table of elements. We just have the formation of bacteria. Then you have algae as these cells link together into binding. They start binding, joining into groups. And then we have the formation of the first organs. The plants develop the first organ, the organ of the embryo. So these are called embryophytes. And they have this little embryo that they've developed. And this corresponds to the formation of an identity now. The taking on of an identity within the plant kingdom begins here. And these are all, I think, water plants. And psilophytales, or many-tissued plants that come in here, representing the principle of combination. And then representing the principle of growth, the plant-like principle of growth itself, you have what we call the calamites, which are segmented. And this segmentation aspect is common to this whole growth thing, which links with the plant world itself, where you have segmentation always at this level. You have these chains here, you have the worms as annelids in this kingdom, and down here it's Kundalini Yoga, represents the segmentation level within the human consciousness. So you have this growth into segmentation. Then you have the attainment of a new kind of mobility when plants invent the seed. And this is a rather late development, actually. And so that you have seed-bearing plants representing the mobility of the animal kingdom within the plant world. And then finally, the crowning flower of the entire plant kingdom is flowering plants, which are a very late development in the plant world. They emerge about the time of the dinosaurs. Flowering plants do. And they represent the dominion of that kingdom. And then moving right along down into the animal world, which is the world of mobility. There's an increase in mobility now when you move into the animal world itself. But then we have the recapitulation where protozoa are to this kingdom as light is to the whole, the principle of potentiality. So this whole row here represents the seed of each one of these. Potentiality is the seed form from out of which the entire kingdom will eventually unfold. So you have one single-celled protozoa, then you move into sponges, which are these little beings with many cells. This is the principle of binding. Then you move from the principle of binding into the formation of an identity within the animal world by the first organ that's invented by animals, which is the stomach. Coelenterans, seal means stomach. And this corresponds to the formation of an identity in the plant kingdom with the formation of the first organ there, the embryo. So now we have the formation of a stomach, so that animals begin to develop this idea of eating other animals. So we have single organ, many organ, the mollusks and clams. There are actually generally 8 animal kingdoms, but Young collapses 2 of them. He says if you collapse the distinction between starfish and mollusks, which is strictly a radial distinction, then you can create one kingdom out of them and get your 7. And for Steiner there were 7. Principle of combination. So in other words, this level here, the combination level, is the fall. For each level, this is the maximum in each level that it has fallen down into total bondage. And then it begins at that level to reiterate the whole arc of beginning to figure out new ways within that level to create new kinds of mobility. to reattain that primary freedom. So the worms come in at the annelid level, and the worms invented laid down the rudiments for the nervous system. Were eventually, ultimately built up out of the, we've retained the worm within us in the form of the intestines. That's really all a worm is. It's a traveling intestine. And the segmentation of the annelid kingdom links on with the segmentation principle of this world of growth. And then the arthropods come in, and they develop, this is the chain with side chains, that you have proteins chains with side chains, and you have the formation of the seed in the plant world. Now with arthropods, you have all these legs, and you have a new ability to move around very quickly with crabs and crustaceans, lobster, and the insects. Those are all part of the same kingdom. And then finally, the ultimate development of the nervous system and the vertebrates. And the vertebrates are to this kingdom what flowering plants were to the kingdom of plants, what DNA and viruses were to that kingdom, and what radioactive elements are to the kingdom of periodic table of the elements. So we have the vertebrate kingdom reattaining this dominion. Birds, I think, are just considered vertebrates, unless I'm mistaken. So then he moves into the world of human consciousness. And as we have seen, Gebser has broken these down neatly for us. And Jung was at his weakest when it came to culture theory. He was a scientist, more or less, so he's very strong on this other stuff. But when it comes to culture, he's very sketchy. But since we've already seen Gebser's model, it maps on very well with Arthur Young's model. You have man as the primitive hunter, corresponding to the potentiality for the entire human consciousness structure. So I've written Gebser's magical down here. And then Gebser's mythical at the second stage, where you have the formation of binding into tribal societies. And this would correspond actually to the settling in the agrarian world, the discovery of agriculture and the formation of the first settled villages. Now you have people binding together into these tribal societies. And then he has the Greeks here representing the birth of self-consciousness, which corresponds to Gebser's mental structure and Steiner's intellectual soul consciousness. And this is self-consciousness. The formation of an identity, which corresponds to the animal formation of an identity with the stomach, and the plant formation of an identity with the invention of the embryo. And then he says where modern man is now is about where the clam was in its kingdom. That's how much further he believes we have to develop. How much more potentiality that the human has to unfold from out of it, which corresponds about loosely with what Steiner said. We are at the level of the consciousness soul, and we have those other levels of the spirit self, life spirit, and spirit body to look forward to in our development. So that very loosely corresponds. Plus, the level of combination corresponds to our penchant for, analysis and synthesis, putting things together into machines, and our obsession with breaking matter apart and putting it back together, plus our obsession with the determinism of materialism and matter. So he calls this objective thought, and that's the consciousness soul in Steiner. Then he puts the Kundalini structure of consciousness so that you have the segmentation of the chakras linking up with the segmentation principle going all the way up through the realm of growth, the plant-like world. But then he also has this idea that creative genius represents that in human evolution which is capable of, like plants, producing centers off itself which survive the life of the individual. He says his definition of creative genius is, once the person is gone, does the work outlast the life of the person? And if it does, that is the true test of the person's genius. It's got to survive the lifetime of the person over several generations. And it has that plant-like ability to thrust itself into the future that way. And then he says Christ and the Buddha represent, at the level of the animal, the reattainment of this new mobility of consciousness. The whole domain, remember, is capturing the mobility that light had when it started this whole thing. So he has Christ and the Buddha here, and then he leaves it blank at the seventh. He doesn't know what to put there. But that would be the omega point, sort of in Chardin, this ultimate development of human consciousness. I put Steiner's spirit, self, life, spirit, body over there, just because I thought it looked neat. And that really is Arthur Young's model, his updating of the great chain of being.